Welcome to Tales from the Fandom, a podcast that brings a special guest out of the multiverse and straight to you. And now your host, David Ginsburg.
And welcome to Tales from the Fandom, the podcast that brings a special guest out of the multiverse and straight to you. Today's guest is Jeff Stormer of the Party of One podcast, and he is here to bring a ton of knowledge, not only about tabletop gaming, but about some other projects too. Welcome to the podcast, Jeff.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here. I love talking about fandom stuff.
Oh, I love that, number one, that you even agreed to come on. I was super excited. I've been a follower of yours on Twitter for probably a good year and a half, and it's just incredible, like what you do on your podcast. And I'm excited to talk about that, later on in the episode.
Thank you. That really means a lot. That's why I do what I do.
Now, one of the things that you had talked about as far as a fandom that I've covered occasionally on the podcast is professional wrestling.
I love professional wrestling. It is my home away from home away from home.
Now, how did you become a fan of pro wrestling?
My wife tricked me, and I resent her for this. My wife was huge into professional wrestling when she was a teenager. She fell out of it when she was in college, and then... So the full story is starts on Christmas Eve in 2012. Yeah, 2012. Christmas Eve. My wife and we visit our parents. We would go out to dinner with my parents every year and then go see her father after that. Well, my car that I had just purchased a few months earlier, the timing belt broke. And so we were stranded at my parents' place on Christmas Eve trying to figure out how we could get up to North Jersey.
Oh, my goodness.
My mom is a giant fan of NCIS, which is a weird thing for anyone to be a giant fan of, but I'm not going to judge. But she had been watching NCIS, and it ended, and Monday Night Raw started. And so my wife, who was formerly a wrestling fan, started watching, and this was specifically because it was Christmas Eve. They did a very special Christmas Eve Raw where Santa Claus got hit by a car, and they had to have a Miracle on 34th Street fight to defend Santa's honor. And it was very weird, and it's actually a beautiful little piece of Christmas media, which is another fandom that I could talk a lot about, but we'll save that for December. And so my wife is watching this and immediately is just like, oh my goodness, and actually the very specific moment when she's like, oh my gosh, I think I'm falling back in love with wrestling is she's watching Santa Claus walk to the ring. And she's like, why is Santa Claus limping? Why does it seem like Santa Claus has a bad, and then Santa Claus put a stocking on his fist at a dramatic moment and hit Alberto Del Rio with the mandible claw. And she's like, oh my God, Mick Foley is dressed as Santa Claus. Oh, and because Mankind was her favorite wrestler as a teenager. So she's like, oh no, this is going to be a thing. So she started showing me WWE. They had a lot of documentaries on Netflix at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, this is kind of fun. Wrestling's not my thing. I was the kid that was like, it's fake, right? Which I'm embarrassed about now, but it is what it is. I started watching these, and then she put on an episode of WWE Main Event, and a guy named Antonio Cesaro lifted up a 7-foot tall 400-pound man, deadlifted him and then slammed him, and I went, oh no, I think I'm falling in love with wrestling. And that was the story of how I fell real hard into professional wrestling.
So this is like a Christmas gift to you. It
was a Christmas gift from the universe and from my wife.
That's awesome. I mean, I remember when I got into it is mostly because when I was younger, I got sick a lot, and my mom would bring home videotapes. And one of the videotapes she brought home was this 3-hour wrestling videotape. And that was it. And I got into it. And then I went all through probably up until the early 2000s. And now it's more of I check in on it, but I'm not watching it. My wife has no interest in it at all. And some of the stories are a bit much at times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we stopped watching WWE about maybe 2 years ago, maybe a year or 2 years ago. We check in for the larger shows with our friends, But part of that was because we fell so madly, like we both real quickly fell so madly in love with the world of indie wrestling and wrestling, and not necessarily indie wrestling because some of them are still owned by corporations, but just the world of wrestling outside of WWE captivated us so thoroughly that we only check in on WWE maybe 2-3 times a year, but we're
Mhm.
watching other shows like at least once a week.
What's the draw for you for the world of wrestling outside of the WWE?
I think it's the storytelling more than anything. Like wrestling is a very interesting art form. The storytelling possibilities are very interesting and odd, and it's an art form that is unlike many other art forms, with the exception of live action role playing, because wrestling is secretly the world's oldest LARP. But like for me, the thing is outside of WWE, there's more of a commitment to like we are a storytelling medium and we are going to tell stories that pay off. WWE is often it's often I've often seen it described as as storytelling by committee, like where it's a corporation or more accurately a 70-year-old man who has long lost any passion for wrestling saying, "Well, this is what the business calls for, so we're going to go with this whether or not the story makes sense."
Hmm.
Whereas if I go to a Chikara or a DDT show, like I can watch it and go, "Oh, this character is acting this certain specific way because 6 months earlier, he lost a title match, and so like he is kind of trying to prove to this one wrestler that he is better than him. Like he's trying to prove that he still has it. He hasn't forgotten about that title, and like it's a lot of speculation. It's a lot of like but like you see those details in a way that I hadn't seen it in WWE in a very long time. You see like alliances sort of form and dissolve, but sort of still linger. Like two people will team together and they'll have little moments where they're like, yeah, we're still friends. We're still partners, even if we're not like having a storyline anymore. And you're like, oh, because they were doing this like a year and a half ago, they're having this little callback now. There's little bits of payoff, whether it be a big storyline thing or a little tiny character detail that I feel like are there. And also I think that there's more. I think the other half of it is there's more stuff you can do when you have a much smaller audience. You can get way weirder with it when you're not trying to appeal to like $1 billion corporation. So you can have, time travel show up sometimes, or, a character be really afraid of ghost stories. And that's just a plot point that they just drop in because they can. And they're like, well, we have like a couple hundred people here. Let's give them something weird and fun and different.
Exactly. And it is absolutely true that the like especially with the WWE product that it has changed over time. Like you used to have those stories
Hmm.
where it would build not even just for like 6 months to a year to like a year and a half, because at the time that I was watching, mostly like in the 80s and 90s, you didn't have as many shows, you didn't have as many
Hmm.
pay-per-views, and you had that time to like build up to like say a Survivor series where maybe the one guy has been picked on by a couple of and he needs to go find people to kind of have allies against. Or even when they had things like the when like is in the late 90s is the Heart Foundation,
Hmm.
and you had to get those like other people together to like stop them from being the bad guys. But now it's just so much in such a quick cycle that things are forgotten, things are just
Hmm.
lost, and they don't follow through anymore. And it is absolutely the case, like you said, where they have the room to do what they want, to do their own stories, to
Hmm.
follow their stories, especially. And I know that some of the indie wrestlers, they go from company to company sometimes, but they can still carry that story along with them if they so choose.
Oh yeah, for sure. And so that's another one of the things that I really like is that like I can follow a wrestler from place to place and like watch them and sort of see different sides of that character and see them kind of playing with different parts of their persona and be like, oh, okay, you're doing like a heel thing here because and it's like different than what you're doing elsewhere, and seeing the way that sometimes they'll play different characters or they'll have different persona. It's just really interesting It's a really it's just there's so much to like the weirdness of the indie wrestling world that is just very it appeals to a certain part of my heart that I've never fully been able to put into words.
Do you have any particular favorite wrestlers that you follow currently?
I do. I am a like there are I'm a big fan of the a Japanese company called DDT, Dramatic Dream Team. It's sort of half like hard-hitting strong style wrestling and half really weird WWE satire, and it's very good. And they have their technically their former ace because he lost a match to their new ace. They're one of their main stars, Hiroshima, is I love him. I love him so much. He's just a good smiling boy who believes in trying hard and doing the right thing. I found out that I'm a real sucker for an ace. The ace being like the big star who is a good-hearted person, the kind of the John Cena who is like a good person who's been around for 10 years carrying the company and is a little older and is a little more tired but is still trying to do the right thing. That just that I feel that. I the second you are like, "Oh yeah, this person's been at the top of the show for 10 years and is trying to find a replacement, but no one's been able to beat him yet." I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
"Oh, why would anyone want to beat him? Why would anyone want to beat him? He's perfect." So I like Hiroshima a lot. I like there's a wrestler on the American Indies who wrestles a lot for Chikara, who's become a friend of mine, but who's also just my favorite wrestler in the world, and his name is Ophidian the Cobra. He is a snake-themed luchador who is known for using you may have seen a video called "The Most Illegal Move in Professional Wrestling." It went viral, and it involved using hypnosis. As he is a snake, he sort of wheelbarrowed on his tag team partner Amasis the Funky Pharaoh, and he kind of did the wavy like snake charm dance and hypnotize. He does this fairly often, and he hypnotizes his opponents, and it's very good. But also, he is just an incredible acrobat and performer, and just the nicest guy. He's just great. I love him. I love him. He's probably my favorite wrestler in the world.
That
I had to check if I was. I had to make sure I wasn't wearing my Ophidian the Cobra shirt literally right now.
that's one of the things that I loved back in the late 90s when WCW was still around, is that they had dedicated time every show for luchador wrestling, because the wrestlers that come from Mexico or they come from Japan, they have that style, that high flying style. I loved watching it.
It's breathtaking. It's breathtaking to just watch, even without like storytelling. You just watch the physical things that they do, and you're just like, how do you do that?
Exactly. Like sometimes I fall up the stairs like that. That's my incredible, awesome, moves. And I don't understand how you can get your body to rotate like that. What they do is crazy.
Oh, which reminds me of people doing things that I watch and go, why would you do that? Why would you do this thing? Reminds me of my other two favorite wrestlers, which I should at least briefly name drop because we don't have time for me to go into the story of all of the brutal story of love, redemption, and reuniting that is. But two of my favorites are the Golden Lovers, Kenny Omega and Kota Ibushi. They are perfect. Their storyline is a 10-year saga of romance, betrayal, and like redemption. And I do not have 45 minutes to tell you their story, but one day I will sit down and tell the world the story because it is everything perfect in wrestling.
For people, I know that it's tough for maybe people that are listening to the show. WWE is the big one, and I know that like New Japan World currently has like their streaming service. What would your recommendations be, not only for like shows to watch or like promotions to watch, but how to watch them, or even if it's just go down to your local wrestling event that happens?
So it's the great thing about living in 2018. The only great thing about living in the year 2018 is wrestling streaming services are actually really easy to set up. There are a lot of them. DDT, which I mentioned as sort of a weird semi-comedy, semi-hard-hitting, like it has kind of something. They kind of have a something for everyone mentality, and it is my absolute like favorite promotion. You can find they have a streaming service called DDT Universe, which streams a lot of their live streams a lot of their shows, which is not the most convenient timing if you're in America, but you know, I'm willing to stay up for till 2 a.m. to watch great wrestling. That's just how I live. So DDT Universe, Chikara, which is another great promotion. Chikara is wrestling by way of superhero comic books and like sci-fi stories. When I mentioned time travel, that was not an exaggeration. Chikara had a years-long time travel storyline, which culminated in 2015 when the time traveler who had first appeared in 2011 reappeared in the future and then got sent back to the past, closing that time loop. It was a great moment to see live. Chikara is, you know, they are often very silly and often extremely superhero and comic book inspired, and they are an all ages promotion. I love them. Ophidian works for them a lot. They're very, very good. You can find them at Chikaratopia. They also have a streaming service, which is, I think, like $8 a month. It's not expensive. Like, there are a lot of good streaming services for a lot of very good companies.
That's awesome. I know, you know, that's one of the things I always love is being able to find these things. Back in the day, it used to be tape trading, where people would trade tapes from Japan or Mexico, and now it's just YouTube or you find them on stream somewhere.
Yeah, there are a lot of very good streams. There's a lot of good stuff also on YouTube. If you just like start looking for wrestling, you'll find a lot of very good videos. And so it's the nice thing is that it is easier than ever to both get into and financially support wrestling that is not the wrestling that's on TV. And I as someone who is independent art to his core, I've always been deeply excited by that. Like, I've been able to watch a lot of wrestling that even 10 years ago I would never have been able to find. A lot of just one-off DDT shows or one-off like AAA streams a lot of their stuff on Twitch. AAA being like the world, like one of the largest like lucha promotions. They stream a lot of their stuff on Twitch, and you can just go onto Twitch and just watch it for free and just see some not always great wrestling, because AAA can be a little bit of a train wreck, but you'll always get to see at least some great wrestling just, you know, hopping onto Twitch or checking out, like, I don't remember if they stream as much on Twitch as they used to, but Kaiju Big Battle, which is a wrestling organization in which all of the wrestlers wear kaiju outfits, which of course are giant rubber Japanese monster suits. Kaiju Big Battle, real good. Kaiju Big Battle also used to stream on Twitch. There's a lot of their matches on YouTube that you can watch. It's a good time to be a wrestling fan, especially if you're interested in weird wrestling.
That's awesome. And I know, you know, they pro wrestling has really great stories. And then on the flip side with pro wrestling and storytelling is something else that you're into fandom wise, and that's tabletop role playing games.
Yes, which are, I maintain the same thing. I maintain this is two sides of the same coin. Name drop or shout out to Nathan Paletta's Worldwide Wrestling, which includes an essay by Epadiah Ravachol, who wrote Dread, which is the Jenga Tower horror game. And he famously wrote, I say famously, but it's only really famous to me because this resonated really hard with me. He writes in an essay in Worldwide Wrestling that, like, if you go to a wrestling show, every single person in that room is role playing. Because it's the performers on stage are playing a character, and, you know, obviously they're not really hitting each other, or if they are, they're doing it in a way to minimize injury, but they're playing a character. But so is the person in the front row who is so mad that the heel just won that they're throwing trash into the ring. Like, they know it's a show, but they are role playing. And so this is a very nice segue. Like, it's a nice segue because they are really, there's that element that everyone in that room is sort of playing a part to tell a story. And it's kind of the only real two art forms that I know of that kind of ask not just the performers, but the audience and the merch sell and like everyone else present to do that. So let's segue from that into role-playing games.
Well, how did you get into tabletop role-playing?
Random chance. My brothers and I found a copy of a role-playing game called Middle Earth Role-Playing. This was in the late 90s, probably 90. maybe 97. It was in like between 96 and 98 because I was for 2 years of my life I was in rural Oklahoma. And I was between those years, we found a copy of Middle Earth Role Playing, which is based on a game called Roll Master, which is if you've never heard of it, that it explains a lot. It was not a game that an 8-year-old could figure out. I read it a year or two ago. Not really a game a 30-year-old can figure out either. But we found it, and we were all really big into video game role-playing games. You know, your Dragon Warriors, your Breaths of Fire. And we were like, let's buy this. It's like a video game book. And we all sat down and read it and went, what? I don't. And we read through it and we tried to play it. We were like, okay, cool. We're going to like tell stories together and then roll dice. And there's a lot of tables, a whole lot of table. And so we gave it a shot and it didn't follow. It didn't, but there was something in that trying to do that hooked me. And so a few years after that, or maybe not even, we were still in Oklahoma. So it must've been a few months after that, we had picked up the Star Wars D6 role-playing game.
Yes.
Gave that a shot, and like that was a little closer to something that we could understand. And then of all things, like as we were trying to understand this weird thing that just did not make a whole lot of sense, even coming from a background of video game role-playing games and Magic the Gathering, like we just could not fully piece this together. Then there aired an episode of the cartoon Dexter's Lab that was Dungeons and Dragons themed, in which they play Dungeons and Dragons, wacky hijinks ensue, and watching it, I'm just like, I remember being like 9 years old, watching it, being like, oh, that's what it's supposed to be? I could do that. And then like all of those books that I had purchased suddenly started to make more sense, and I was like, oh, is okay. Yeah, I could do that. And then maybe like 2 years after that, D&D 3rd edition came out. And we bought that, and I was in high school at that point. We had, I had gathered a friend group together, and we started playing, and I never stopped. And that was 20 years ago, maybe.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm looking at my role-playing books now. My first purchase ever for role-playing books was the Star Wars D6.
Nice.
I still have it to this day. And then after that was second edition D&D, and then 3rd edition, and then it's all downhill from there.
Yep, that's when they got you. At that point, I was like, well, this is it. I'm done now.
What are your favorite games to play?
That's
a tough question.
Oh no, it's fine. Obviously, I really like Worldwide Wrestling because I really like wrestling, and it is a natural extension of the thing that I like. But also, it's a brilliantly designed piece of role playing, like of art, of game design. I'm a big sucker for weird little games, which is a phrase that I picked up in a conversation with game designer Hannah Schaefer in describing kind of games that before Kickstarter would never have been a thing. If you come to me and you're like, hey, this game is about like feeling uncomfortable at a party, and that's it. I'm like, well, yeah, I'm gonna play that game. That sounds great. I'm gonna be uncomfortable at party. Let's do it. Let's bust out those dice. But like, I'm a big fan of the game Paranoia, which is a delightful sort of satirical role-playing game about an adventuring party in a horrible, like, dystopic vision of like 80s sci-fi, where you're in an underground bunker observed by a megalomaniacal computer that has been sabotaged so much that it has completely just turned into a totalitarian despot. But it's still friendly because it's friend computer. So it just expects you to be happy all the time, because not being happy is treasonous, and not being happy would imply friend computer is failing. And you don't think friend computer is failing, because if you think friend computer is failing, that's treason. And so I really love the sort of satirical edge of Paranoia. I love weird, sad feelings games a lot. And I really like. I'm a big fan of. I like a lot of games. There are a lot of games that I could go on and on and on about.
Yeah, it's I know I was talking to someone probably a year ago, especially about Kickstarter, and it's always something that I've been saying to a lot of people is that it feels like we're living in this wonderful role-playing age of
Hmm.
not only are people who you'd never think would be getting into like tabletop gaming, they're in tabletop gaming, but all these creative ideas and creative games are coming out where you wouldn't have seen them 10, 15, 20 years ago
Oh, for
because
sure.
you would have had to have published them and put them on the bookshelf somewhere and try to sell them that way. And now it's like, sure, I will pay $10 for a PDF.
Yeah. It's easier. It is much like with wrestling. It is easier than ever to make a thing, put it out in the world, and find and like just have that thing be out in the world. Like it is easier than ever to make and publish and promote a thing in the world that we live in right now, and that
Mhm.
is amazing to watch.
It is. It's wonderful, especially when you follow so many people and every day it's like so and so backed this role playing game or this card game or this board game, and I'm like, I don't know how I'm going to find time to play them, but I want to at least read them and support the
Hmm.
person that's done it, done that service.
Yeah, for sure. That's where the only bad part is that I'm constantly seeing people be like, "Hey, I backed this amazing thing," and I'm like, "Okay, yeah, yeah, that's okay, done. That's $10 gone. Yes, I want because I want to. Oh, like I want this, and this is it's bad. It's bad for encouraging the habit. Is how I will describe it.
I always tell I tell some of my friends that they don't live close enough for me to game with, but they live close enough to me to like wish that we could game together. I'm like, I've got this great game, but you'd have to learn it and then we'd have to find time to play it. And yeah, that's not going to happen right now.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. If you were talking to somebody about getting into tabletop gaming, and obviously like Dungeons and Dragons is that big, everyone kind of knows what D&D is through like, just hearing about it, watching Stranger Things, seeing it somewhere. But what games would you suggest if someone was new trying to get into tabletop gaming that wasn't D&D?
It's funny you ask it that way because honestly, I probably wouldn't even suggest D&D to begin with. Like I would, it would. I mean, I think the biggest question is if somebody is looking, if somebody says to me, "Hey, I want to play D&D," the first thing that I'm going to ask them is like, "Okay, what are you into?" Because like I think it's a tough. Here's my D&D tangent. I think D&D is a tough game to start with. I've thought a lot about it. I think there are a lot of pros and a lot of cons to D&D as a game. But I think it's great because it's a game with a lot of rules that make it very easy to be like, okay, I swing my sword. Here are the sword swinging rules. I know how to do this. It's not asking you to just jump in without any guidance.
Hmm.
But I also think that this is my controversial take on D&D is that it does a very specific thing. There are always people that are like, well, you could use it to do anything. And I'm like, yeah, kind of. But D&D is also really specifically a game about going into dungeons and fighting monsters in those dungeons and reaping rewards from fighting those monsters in those dungeons. Like you look at the layout of the rule book, the game is specifically telling you this is what the game is most equipped to do. And so if that's not something that I think the person would be specifically interested in, I'm going to be hesitant to recommend them D&D outright.
Hmm.
As always, I tag this controversial opinion with the sacred "don't at me" because I do not want to be added about this. But I would probably base it on like what I know about the person and like what they're into. Because the nice thing about the role playing game hobby right now is there are so many games that you can find something that's real specifically like if the person really really enjoys like cooking shows, Fate just put out a cooking show game. Like, there's a cooking show setting for Fate. And I could be like, oh, you want to play a cooking show? Like, I have rules for that. Oh, you're really into Star Wars. Let me point you to a Star Wars game and sort of like show you that like you can make your own Star War. Like, that's just a thing you can do.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, you really like superheroes. Let me talk to you about Masks, because Masks is it tells great superhero stories.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that to answer your question with a question, which I know is insufferable, I think the question I have to ask if somebody's like, hey, I want to get into D&D is like, okay, what kind of stories do you really, really resonate with? Like, what are the things that you're into that are your like lifeblood hobbies? Like for me, like, you know, if somebody had sat me, if the game had existed when I was, well, I guess like 5 years. Yeah, I guess timing doesn't make sense, but like if me now had never played a role-playing game, and I came to, okay, here's the scenario. We have to set this up. An alternate universe version of me has walked through a portal that has never played a role-playing game, but every other event in his life has played out exactly the same way. 1, I want to hear his podcast because it's probably fascinating. 2, he says to me, hey, I've heard great things about D&D. How would you get into it? I would say, let me show you Worldwide Wrestling. This is a game that lets you play a wrestling show. You play wrestlers, you play the performers playing those wrestling characters. It's designed for a group environment. It's silly, it's fun, and it captures the things that you, Jeff Stormer of another universe, like about professional wrestling. I'd have been hooked. Alternate universe me would be hooked on that role-playing game because it is a thing that speaks to a thing that I specifically am really passionate about.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what's great about role-playing games in 2018 is there are so many games that you can pretty comfortably do that no matter how sort of narrow or specific someone's interests are.
Oh, definitely. And you know, that's the great thing now is that we have that option, that opportunity. You know, is tough back in it when I started gaming is like, okay, well, you have D&D and you've got Vampire and you've got Rifts and you've got a few other things, but you know, those are kind of like some of the big ones. Star Wars was out and about, but not as popular. It's like, okay, those are really your choices. And then it started getting a bit broader, and now it's just like you throw a stick, you know, throw a stone somewhere, and you hit whatever you want to play.
Yeah. It's what a time to be alive. Moon pie. We probably don't have 15 more minutes to just segue into old Simpsons talk, so we'll table that for another day, but it's on the agenda.
Absolutely. Now, you mentioned podcast, and one of the things that you do is a podcast called The Party of One.
Party of One is it's my baby. It's my child.
You started it back in November of 2015.
That is correct.
What is the premise of your podcast, which is not a Party of Five podcast, by the way, just in case people are curious about that?
It is not. Party of One is an actual play podcast focused on 2-player role-playing experiences. Every week I sit down with a friend, we play a 2-player game, we share some laughs, maybe a few tears, and we have a really good time. Episodes range from hilarious to heartbreaking. There's a lot of different genres, settings, styles of play that are kind of often overlooked in the tabletop hobby that we're kind of exploring on the show. And I think it's a good show. I think it's a good picture of a different style of role-playing than people might be used to.
How did you come up with the idea for the podcast?
It was easier to book guests is the answer to the question. No, I'd been interested in 2-player role-playing games for a really long time. And it was something that like I had been looking into like a few years, probably right around the time I was getting into pro wrestling was right after my then girlfriend, now wife had moved in together. Like we had moved in together. And at the time, like I had just left kind of like a D&D group that like I wasn't really into. It was like they were very good friends of mine, but it was a D&D group that I was not gelling with even a little bit. And it was at a point in my life when I was falling out of love with Dungeons and Dragons in a very particular way. so I didn't have a D&D group anymore. I didn't have like a weekly game anymore. I didn't have anything that I was doing. And my wife was like, well, are there games that like just the two of us could play? Like, because we hang out a bunch and we're always looking for stuff to do together. And I started looking into it. And at the time, there really weren't. This was probably 2012, 2013.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, there really weren't. If you search for two-player role-playing games on Google, just pulled back like articles on, I don't know, maybe just have your player play 4 players and treat it like a miniatures game. I don't know. You'll make it work somehow. And so, like that, it's been something that I'd been researching for years, for a long time. And then I fell in love with podcasts, specifically a podcast called One Shot. I've been listening to a lot of One Shot and a lot of Campaign, and they kind of opened the door into other like actual play podcasts. And I had been like listening to a lot of them. I had been kind of looking for like a creative outlet for a while, and then a friend of mine, my friend Noah, who was our first guest on Party of One, had happened to be like, hey, we're looking to expand our show into a network. Do you have any ideas for podcasts? And I was like, well, I got one. Well, actually, more specifically, my wife was like, well, why don't you just do the 2-player role-playing game thing? And I was like, I could do that. So I pitched it. Their network fell through. So I just had this idea that I was like, well, I have this thing that I really wanted to make. I think I'm just going to do it. I think I'm just going to make this into a thing that I do it. Like, and originally it was supposed to just be a thing that I did when I could with a friend. And then it happened. And then like things happened to fall into place that like I was like, oh, I think actually this might be a thing that I could do more frequently and have like a broader reach with.
Mm-hmm.
So I started doing it, and that was kind of when I was like, well, maybe I do this every week, and we just do it every week until I feel exhausted, and then I scale it back to once a month or whatever. And that was 2.5 years ago.
Yeah, it's incredible. Not only because I was looking at it when the podcast started, but the number of episodes, first of all, and then the variety of games that you have on the show.
We play a lot of different. Every episode is me, like I said, is me with one other person, and it's a different game and a different guest every week. So there's an incredible variety. Much like how there's a role-playing game that you'll love no matter like what you're into, I'm pretty sure there's a Party of One that will hook you no matter what you're interested in. That's a bold claim, but it's a claim that I stand by. Because we have so many genres and settings and moods that like I can pretty comfortably recommend a podcast that is suited to your interests no matter what those interests are.
Are there any particular games that you found that work the best with just the 1-player or 2-player setting?
Well, the nice thing is that like since I started the podcast, there's been kind of a boom of like games designed specifically for 2 people, which has been the coolest thing to kind of watch and not be like, I often say I'm not a part of it, but like I'm playing the games and spotlighting them. So I have to be better about owning the fact that like this is a thing that I'm a part of. But like there's been a real boom in games that are very specifically designed not only to be played with 2 people, but to really beautifully take advantage of that 2-player environment and sort of the unique relationship that we have as 2 people in an intimate conversation. And so like it's been really exciting because originally the show, I pitched it as I'm going to play role-playing games with 1 player because that kind of was the only option that I had when I pitched the show.
Right.
But then, like, suddenly I was introduced to this deep, almost endless well of games that had been designed specifically for 2 people. And it kind of changed the entire pitch of the show. Because suddenly it was no longer, well, let's see what happens if I play D&D with 1 other person. And now it's, okay, cool. This is a game that uniquely challenges you to be in a space with 1 other person and tell a story that only 2 people sitting across a table from each other can tell. And I think that the show has survived as long as it has and has been as successful as it has, both in terms of numbers, which is not the most successful, but it's decent. And also in terms of like personal satisfaction. The show that I originally launched, I don't know if I'd be still doing 3 years later. The show that I'm doing now, I could do 10 years from now.
And that's always the good thing, is being, enjoying what you're doing,
Yeah.
and having the people that you have come on, and also, getting something out of it where they're enjoying it, and they could even take it back to their friends or their family, and run something similar or do something on those on those lines. Because one of the things that I found is, when my wife and I were traveling for a while for her job, is that we always tried to find something to do just the two of us, and we could only find like 2-player card games
Mm-hmm.
or a 2-player board game, and it's not bad. It just wasn't fun. And I even had floated the idea of, oh, we could do like a 1-player vampire game or a 1-player D&D game, but it's still not the same. It's still not as fun as having multiple people, because it's not really designed for that. At least back then it wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen some stuff now where they have like 1-player, 2-player D&D like modules that are being published. But yeah, it's super awesome that they have the amount of material out now to have that kind of have that game going on.
Yeah, it's a really cool thing to kind of see happening, and to see kind of like this area of role playing that I am a part of, like full, like exploding in a way that I never thought that it would.
Do you have any favorite games that you've featured on the podcast, or any favorite episodes where you can point to and be like, if you're interested in learning about like 2-player role playing games, like you would spotlight those episodes or those games that you have?
So I have a few based on like what type of story that you want to hear. I can always recommend a few of my favorites. If you want something kind of sillier and more goofy, there's an episode. I'm not going to remember the episode numbers, but I remember the titles. Then you can find them from there.
Mhm.
Is Roll for Shoes with Aaron Catano Saez. Aaron being my co-host on my other podcast, All My Fantasy Children, which is about character creation and role playing games. We played a game that was it's very silly, and the game itself is very designed to be very silly and very like improvisational. That one is extremely silly. There's no serious moment in that episode, and it is pure hilarity. I think that is one of our funniest episodes. If you want something on the scarier side, there's a 2-player game called Cthulhu Confidential by Pelgrane Press. I played that with Senda from She's a Super Geek. I think that episode is genuinely kind of terrifying. I think that's a terrifying episode. If you want something that is just going to leave you good and sad, Our Radios Are Dying with Strix is about 2 lesbian lovers dying in space and having their last conversation, and it's exactly as bright, sunny, and cheerful as it sounds. And it's a good 100 episodes later. It's in our first 20 episodes. 100 episodes later, I still don't know. I still think that might be in our top 5 episodes.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good episode. And then also, if you want something on really just like sweet and kind of innocent and pure, played a game called A Cozy Den with Kira McGran. It's about lesba snakes, which are half snake, half human, all lesbian. And they're just in a like cozy relationship trying to get through the winter together. And it's a lot of like domestic drama that is just like really sweet and wholesome. And if you just want to listen to something kind of calm and comforting, like that's also there.
Okay, awesome. And when do you release episodes?
Episodes release every Tuesday unless something happens where I don't release it on Tuesday. Tuesday or Wednesday is what I generally say.
Okay. Now, on top of the podcasts that you do, you are also launching a Kickstarter project, which
Yes, indeed.
by the time this episode comes out, it'll already have started. And it is called Mission Accomplished.
Mission accomplished. There's a salute in the title that I haven't figured out how to put into text yet, but it's there, and it's very important.
Now, what is Mission Accomplished?
Mission Accomplished is the role-playing game of super spies and office meetings. Basically, 4 to 8 players take on the role of a team of secret agents. You've just saved the world, you've killed the bad guys, you've done it, you win. except now you have to go back to HQ and have a meeting with management to figure out who gets the credit and who gets the blame for what went wrong. By the end of the night, somebody is getting burned and somebody is getting that corner office promotion, you know, the one with the floor to ceiling windows and the company credit card that's, you know, only for emergencies, but emergencies. And it is a collaborative, satirical, and the whole game takes under 2 hours, including character creation.
That's awesome. Now, how did you come up with this project? Like, how did you come up with the game?
So the game really came from its earliest iteration was an experiment to see if I could make a game of Paranoia that could be played with 2 players. Because Paranoia as a game is very much based on like players keeping secrets from each other. And, you know, creating that feeling of appropriate to the title Paranoia. It is not a game that works with 2 players. We played it once on the show and like it was fun, but it doesn't feel like Paranoia as a game. So my experience, so it was originally like I wanted to do a Paranoia game for the show. I wanted to do like a live Paranoia event. So I wrote this 1-page RPG about like, okay, cool, this is how it's going to work. And the way that I think it should work is I, as sort of your boss, am going to write down some things that you did that you don't know about. You're going to write down some things that you did and we're both going to take turns revealing these cards and having a conversation. And like, I wrote it as 2+ players. So like, and I was like, okay, so more players could do this, and it could just be about like the cards could just say whatever you wanted. At which point, like, I played it the first time, or I listened to a playtest of it. Some very nice people on the One Shot Fan Discord put together a game of it, and I listened to it. And as I was listening, I had this horrible, horrible realization where I was like, oh, this is going to be a game that I work on for a very long time, isn't it? Like, this game has potential, and I hate that. I hate that because it means I'm going to be working on this for a long time. And so, yeah, once I listened to it and I kind of heard what their recommendations and like how they kind of wanted, like their suggestions and where they kind of bumped up against the rules that I had written, I was kind of like, okay, now it needs X, Y, and Z. But if it's going to have X, Y, and Z, it's got to have rules for A, B, and C as well. And so what it ended up with was a game that is 100% not playable with 2 people, because somehow I did that, and I'm not sure how. And I realized the irony in that the party of 1 guy wrote a game that can't be played with 2 players. I get it. I know that. But I just ended up with this game that really is very cool and structurally different and is based on like everyone having based on everyone having secrets about other players but not knowing the secrets that players have about you. I'm real happy with it. I've worked on it for about 1.5 years now, and it's finally to a place that I'm like, I think it's done. I think it's to a point where I want to take it to the next steps.
And the next steps is obviously Kickstarter, because that's where all the games are going. And
yes, indeed,
just like we talked about earlier, it's easier to get things out through Kickstarter and getting the people behind it.
Mm-hmm. I'm very excited. We are working with Third Act Publishing, who previously made Reflections, the 2-player game of Dueling Samurai, also Satanic Panic, Domina Magica, and they are a tremendous publisher. I'm really excited about that, and they have a great track record with Kickstarters, and I think, you know, they've been really supportive. Jim McClure, who is sort of the head of Third Act Publishing and my lifelong nemesis, who I swear to one day leave in bloody ruin at my feet. Jim has been a tremendous supporter of the project. He has been a great collaborator. He's really like believed in the project, and I could not be happier working with him and Third Act Publishing to bring this game to the world.
How did you come up with the game? Like, what was the inspiration for it?
So the biggest inspiration for the game, the 2 probably biggest inspirations were my love of Paranoia as a role-playing game, and the particular my love of a TV show called Archer. Archer being an animated spy comedy by the makers of C-Lab 2021. The show is like the game as it's developed. Well, I guess there's the third influence that is also very important, and that being that I have been a soulless cog in a corporate machine for the last 10 years of my life. And so, like, my experiences working in an office day job very, very specifically seeped their way into this game without my knowledge. It wasn't until a playtest and somebody said, "Boy, this was the most fun I've ever had in an office meeting." And I sat there for a second and said, "Oh no. Oh God, I wrote a game about my job. Oh no, what have I done? Oh, what have I done?" And then I leaned into it as hard as I could.
Oh my goodness. That is some funny stuff, because I've sat in those kind of office meetings before, and it's like one of the offices had windows you could look out, and it's like anywhere but here.
Anywhere but here. Oh, and yeah, my office culture is a big influence in the game. My experience being in that meeting where something went wrong and you're just trying to convince your boss that it wasn't your fault, that it was really this person's fault because they messed up, and just doing everything you can to throw somebody else under the bus and just trying to get out of that meeting in one piece, and like getting that passive aggressive email and being like, "Oh, I'm gonna leave. I'm gonna walk out. I'm done. I'm quitting this job," and then working there for 8 more years.
Yep.
And it's real specifically that. But it's also, I mentioned Archer, which I think is the other kind of big influence of the game, because there's a very specific structure to an episode of Archer that I think we've replicated in Mission Accomplished. Being that, like, the episode starts in Mallory's office. She's kind of like, "Well, I hope you can explain yourselves," and we find out that something on a mission has gone horribly wrong. And then piece by piece, all of the agents are like, "Well, as that was happening, I was doing this," and we cut to a quick shot of them doing that. And then we cut back, like something happens when they're explaining, and we cut back, and like it's like, "Well, yeah," and then Ray got shot, and it cuts back and Ray is in a cast, and he's like, "Yeah, you shot me in the arm." And it turns out his arm was just kind of off screen, so this is the first time we're seeing that he's been shot. And so that kind of specific experience of like, "Well, that's not how I remember it." And then we play through how it actually happened, and we get to that, we come back, and it's like, "Oh, yeah, you did get shot, didn't you?" Was something that I really specifically wanted to replicate. Kind of Rashomon-esque, if I can get really like highbrow for exactly 2 seconds.
So, for people that are interested, when they back, besides backing it, are they going to need anything else? Do you need dice? Do you need just a few people to play with?
4 to 8 players, including mission control. So I guess 5 to 9, like 4 to 9 players plus mission control. It also requires index cards, or if you're playing online or digitally, a way to like direct message people, because there's like secret note passing.
Okay.
And then 2 big heaping piles of dice, so like a heaping pile of good dice and bad dice. And that's pretty much it. Dice, index cards, and people. And then like the rule book and handouts.
Okay. So it's not asking too much of people to have, just especially for gamers that are backing. We obviously have dice. Everyone has a dice problem.
Yes.
Even if you don't want to admit it.
The game only runs with 6-sided dice, so like you have a bunch of 6-sided dice.
And if you don't,
and there are dice roller apps.
That's right. Or you can raid Monopoly or any other standard board game that comes with the 6-sided dice.
Yes.
So what's the backing as far as to get my hands on the game?
So we kind of just hammered this out, and we're not, the numbers and stuff and rewards may change, but it's looking like a soft cover of the book is going to run you $20. Awesome. PDF is going to run you about 12. We have some upper level rewards where I will play you through an exclusive like backer game, where you can contribute some material to the rule book, and I'll work with you to sort of make that happen. Or I'll take your ideas and like integrate them into the core rule book. Yeah, but sort of the big ones are, it's going to be, I think the final number that we've landed on is 12 for a PDF, 20 for a rule book, and then I think 35 for 2 rule books if you want one for mission control and one for agents, so that you can mark out the agent section with a bunch of black bars so that they don't get to see your secret GM notes.
And the Kickstarter is planned, I believe, from the email you sent, October 16th through November 15th.
Yes, that is correct. Let me just double check that end date. It's Tuesday to Thursday because that's when you launch Kickstarters. But yeah, it's October 16th and it ends on the 15th. That is correct.
Okay, great. And as far as Kickstarter ends, what's the general ETA, or if you even have that now? Because we're recording this early, so we back it. It closes successfully. When do people get their goodies?
You should be able to get an art-free version of the rules pretty close to when the Kickstarter ends. Like the rules are already written. I'm just kind of assembling them into a book format.
Mm-hmm.
I'm copying and pasting a lot of things into a single book document. That should be ready pretty close to the end of the Kickstarter. And then once we have layout and art, I think the what we're shooting for is like summer 2019.
Okay.
Card subject to change, but I think we're aiming for summer of 2019.
Oh, definitely with the subject to change, because I know, speaking as backers of multiple projects, anything from, shipping delays, printing delay, like there's all sorts of stuff that goes into it on the backside. And it's like, man, I feel bad for the people that, is just you want to bring that project out. You've got the project, and it's just, there's always something.
But we're pretty confident that we'll get it to it before we're pretty confident based on like where we're at with art, where we're at with like getting the text assembled, enough of it is written, formatted, and like finalized that we feel pretty confident that we will not have that any delays that come up should not seriously disrupt us past June of 2019. Or okay. July, summer-ish. I would say probably the best bet is by Gen Con 2019.
Okay.
We would like to have a thing to sell at Gen Con.
What's been the toughest part of getting this mission accomplished, Salute ready?
What has been the toughest part? It's probably been most of the game like clicked into place a lot sooner than I expected. I did not expect to be doing the Kickstarter this soon, because like I had all of the sort of advice that I had been given was like, you're going to be playtesting this game for 2 years minimum. You're going to be playtesting this game. Once I took it to Metatopia last year, like I played it, and almost all the feedback was like, okay, yeah, this game's pretty much done. You're pretty much done with this game. And so like I thought that was going to be the hard part. I thought that like playtesting it, fine-tuning it, fixing things for years and years and hundreds of playtests was going to be the hard part. Turns out it wasn't. I'd say the hardest part has been figuring out how to hook players in the first part of the game. Because the game starts, mission control introduces a mission, and then like collectively the group figures out how some things that went horribly wrong. The reason why you're having this awful team meeting. Figuring out how to involve the players in that, and how to not just make it the GM goes, yeah, here's everything that happened, here's some wacky stuff, have fun with that. But also allowing giving the players enough grounding where I'm like, okay, here's the sit, because we played it. Our first version was the GM just gave you all of the information. What the mission was, what the objective was, what went wrong. Players didn't, and like the feedback I got was like, the only thing I didn't like was I didn't feel like I was hooked in at the beginning of the game. And I was like, okay, that's reasonable. That's a reasonable piece of feedback. Then the second version of it was I took a cue from Dungeon World, and I was like, it's going to be a series of guided questions. It's going to be like, where were you? What was the objective of the mission? Like what went, and like piece it together that way. Players didn't feel like they had enough grounding in the setting. They were hooked, but they were kind of aimless. They were like, I don't know. I don't really know what we're doing here.
Mm-hmm.
So finding that balance, and where we ended up was we have mission dossiers, which are basically like if you're familiar with Fiasco, it's like a playset in Fiasco where it's got some faces, some places, some important plot points and props, and inspiration for agents to go, okay, so this is what the mission is. I'm reading this over. I understand where we are. I understand who's involved. And now I can say that person got killed. They weren't supposed to get killed. They got killed. That's a wacky thing that happened. And so that's been probably the hardest part, is figuring out that early game, first phase of the game part.
Okay. And when it releases, because this podcast is going to come out after the Kickstarter happened or starts.
Right.
I'll
so
make sure.
we're about $300,000 so far.
Oh my gosh. I'll have the link to the Kickstarter in the show notes for everybody, because I can't say like, hey, what's your link for your Kickstarter, because it's not live as we're recording now. But everyone can go click on the link to check it out, to follow it, to insta-back it like a lot of other people are going to be doing on the first day or two that it launches. But where else can people find you besides the Kickstarter link?
You can find me on Twitter at Party of One Pod. You can find Party of One at partyofonepodcast.com. If you want to see my nonsense wrestling tweets, you can follow me on Twitter at DexDynamo. You can also follow my other podcast, All My Fantasy Children, at allmyfantasychildren.com. I also have a third podcast that publishes once a year called Talkin' Nog. It is a podcast about eggnog. You can listen to that at soundcloud.com/talkinnog, because I refuse to pay money for this once a year eggnog podcast. And I think that's pretty much it. You can go to jeffstormer.com to get a better picture of all of the weird projects that I'm involved in.
Awesome. Well, Jeff, I just want to say, number one, thank you for your time coming on and talking about, but I'm super excited. I wish, the Kickstarter the best. I hope, that it exceeds expectations.
I'm just really excited by the time this episode releases that we have already purchased Monty Cook Games with all of the money that we've made. It is the highest grossing Kickstarter of all time, and I'm really pleased with that.
Absolutely.
Thank you for listening to Tales from the Fandom. Subscribe to us on iTunes or your podcast app of choice. Follow us on Facebook at www.facebook.com/talesfromthefandom to see photos, links, leave feedback, and check out upcoming guests. If you'd like to be a guest, email David at talesfromthefandom@gmail.com.